So Garrett is a forest health scientist with the Washington Department of Natural Resources, and he focuses his work on landscape patterns of forest disturbance and supporting adaptive management strategies across all lands. Garrett's current research topics include wildfire and climate change effects on landscape resilience, disturbance interactions, and old growth forest sustainability. He lives in Olympia and enjoys exploring the diverse landscapes of the Pacific Northwest. And interestingly, he grew up in a zoo. So Garrett, you're gonna have to start there.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Well, yeah, let me do a little screen share. First, I'll just say thanks for having me. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I'd love to be joining you along with Andrew, but I just got back from a trip up in the Wenatchee area last night. So at some point, I'd love to get there in person. Yeah, so I've got a few highlights from recent research we've been doing, and I also want to talk a little bit about some of the landscape evaluations work we do and how it might apply in a place where there's a lot more oak cover. So I've kind of got my phone connected here, and I've also got a computer connected. So hopefully you can both hear me and see this cover slide. Does that look all right?
It looks great.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so this idea of trailing edge forests, oh dear, ArcGIS Pro, has been around for a little while, but it's really emphasizes the threat of climate change in places that are currently forested that may no longer be forested in the future. And so this is a research project we did looking across the East Cascades. And so I'm going to share some highlights from this paper. And then I think the next step would really be to think through what we could do in terms of oak woodland applications. And you'll see that the main focus of a lot of our work is on conifer forests in Eastern Washington. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to learn and expand this work into oaks. So the opening image here is really kind of a striking mosaic of fire effects in a dry landscape. This happens to be up near the Methow Valley on the Cedar Creek fire, but it could be any number of landscapes throughout Eastern Washington. And you can see some real interesting patterns in terms of south versus north facing slopes, some of these more open areas where it's more of a woodland setting. And this area that burned in a hot, dry condition in a dry forest, a lot of questions about how it might regenerate and whether it will continue to be a forest. So some of the highlights from this research is that across Washington, East Cascades, they're pretty widespread trailing edge forests, and it's about 20% of the overall landscape, close to 1 million acres, actually. And these forests span a broad range of settings and landowners. And so there's going to need to be a variety of climate adaptation strategies and all hands on deck. And then we focused on where these trailing edge forests had overlapped with high severity wildfire. And so far, there haven't been that many high severity fires in the trailing edge, but these locations are very vulnerable to type conversion when they do burn. And so finally, these trailing edge forest maps can help decision makers prioritize resources for things like post-disturbance reforestation, landscape scale restoration, and wildfire protection and climate adaptation. So I'm not sure how familiar you all are. Andrew is there in the room, and he's an expert in a lot of the policies and plans. So the focus and context for me is this 20-year forest health strategic plan for Eastern Washington. And across Eastern Washington, let's see, this is a slightly outdated map because we're now up to about 47 priority planning areas. So there's another batch for 2024. But you can see these are distributed across Eastern Washington. There's a big cluster of them south and east of Mount Adams. And so one in particular that jumps out, especially for oak woodland conservation and issues, is what we call the Klickitat planning area. And so after I give a few highlights of the trailing edge research, I'll focus in on that Klickitat area for some examples of how we evaluate current conditions and opportunities for treatments and restoration. And so this trailing edge concept, the term's been around for a little while. There was a study by Sean Parks in Montana that looked across the West at characterizing the trailing edge forest. And we're very concerned about changes from forest to non-forest vegetation. So some ecosystem services will be lost, but there also might be restoration of historical conditions. And for a woodland species like oak, a place where the conifer forest might be fading out might be a place where the oak forest could expand. And so some high risks have been identified, but we really felt that we needed more information about the geography and the composition and recent fire activity in these vulnerable locations. And so today I'm just going to share a couple highlights of how we developed our mapping approach and looking at where these trailing edge forests are located, and then overlaying recent fire extent and severity in trailing edge and non-trailing edge forests. And so, as I said, our study focus was across the Eastern Cascades, and we used this focal landscape around Cle Elum as sort of a central location to look a little bit closer at the maps. And we could certainly dig in a little bit more in the southern end in the Columbia Gorge area. And kind of at the core of this analysis is something called climatic water deficit. And we use this deficit map for a lot of different applications to look at drought stress, as well as climate change simulations to look at places that are going to be more vulnerable in the future to drought stress. And so we looked at the current cover of forest, and we looked at the current climatic water deficit. Just a quick question. Can you see my little mouse cursor on the screen? Looks like it's working. Maybe I can even do better with the pointer. Laser pointer. Here we go.
We can see it.
We can see it.
This will be even better. Okay, so up in the upper right, we have the current climatic water deficit, and this is around the Cle Elum area. And you can see there's this really big gradient from low deficit in the blue colors down through green and into this orange, brown, and even red for very high deficit. So you can see there's an overall landscape scale elevation gradient, but there's also some important local scale variations in terms of north and south aspects. So a lot of these green areas that show up here are these north-facing slopes, and the south-facing slopes are a much higher deficit. And then we run these into the future to the year about 2050. So it's not that far into the future, only about 30 years out, and look at the distribution of climatic water deficit. And you can see generally there's less green and blue on this landscape, and there's a bit of a transition happening. And so we take these current and future maps and we look at the distribution of where forest is today, and we're able to delineate this zone, places that are currently forested, which, and then in the future may no longer support forest. And so it's this sort of magenta color that corresponds to these south-facing slopes and lower elevation areas in this example. So, okay. And so across the Eastern Cascades, as I said, we've got about 20% of the forested landscape in trailing edge forest, and they're generally occurring at lower elevations and south-facing slopes. And there's actually quite a lot of this bright pink color in the southern portion of our study area. And I think just to be clear for this audience, when we're talking about forest, we're really focused on places where there are currently conifer trees, which includes pine and Douglas fir and fir. And then just another way to summarize where these trailing forests occur is by land ownership. And so one thing that was pretty interesting is that there's a much more even distribution of trailing edge forests across landowners than there is the actual forest cover. So the Forest Service in general has about 70% of forested acres and about 35% of the trailing edge forest. And then some of the key other components of landowners, including tribal, state, and private landowners, have much more of that trailing edge forest component, which makes sense if you consider we're talking about these lower elevation locations. And in terms of recent fire effects in trailing edge forests, we looked at all the fires that occurred from 1984 to 2020, and then we classified that into low, medium, and high severity, which corresponds to less than 25%, 25 to 75%, and more than 75% tree mortality. And then these two graphs are showing the same information. They're just scaled on the absolute scale on the left and on a relative scale on the right. So you can see overall that all forests had a lot of high severity fire, but these trailing edge forests actually had less high severity than the non-trailing edge forests. And if we take the trailing edge forests themselves and break it out by owner, you can see that there actually was quite a range of fire effects. And our tribal partners and landowners had the most amount, not the most amount, but the highest proportion of high severity fire. And the federal lands had the most overall amount of high severity fire. And then I'd like to just show a couple of example maps of how this plays out when we're looking at places that actually burned in the trailing edge forest. So at this broad regional scale, you can see there haven't been many large fires, or at least through the year 2020, in the southern Cascades portion. Some significant fire events up on the Yakima Reservation lands. And then as you go farther north in the Cascades, quite a few large fire events, and especially the North Cascades. And so looking in again at our focal geography in the Cle Elum area, here's that trailing edge forest map, and here are 3 recent wildfire events. And so if we're really interested in the places that burn at high severity, you can look at this burned. You can also screen out the places that were not high severity. So now we're looking at the locations within this Jolly Mountain fire, and you can see there are quite a few pink patches here. So these are small portions of trailing edge forest, but compared to the amount of trailing edge forest that's on that landscape, so far we haven't had big fire events in the trailing edge portion. So I would say the landscape so far has not experienced these type conversions to non-forest, but it is primed for that. And so just kind of wrapping up trailing edge, because I do want to get into the Klickitat examples. We found that trailing edge forests are widespread and primed for transformation as fire activity continues to increase. And so there are a lot of values at risk and are vulnerable, but some of the transitions in non-forest or woodlands in this case are necessary to foster fire and drought tolerant landscapes. So collaborative planning and monitoring will continue to be essential for understanding these short and long-term dynamics. Okay, I'm going to pivot here and zoom into a more local geography. And just so you know, I'm not talking about the trailing edge forest analysis here. I just wanted to highlight some of the ways we're characterizing these oak woodland landscapes with a lot more oak woodlands, and how this fits into our broader framework of landscape evaluation. So here's what we call the Klickitat planning area, and it's southeast of Mount Adams. And the Klickitat River, runs right through the heart of this area. And you can see it is a transitional place between generally more conifer forest and then more open areas that are, oak, as well as sage, steppe, agriculture, and other non-forest conditions. You can also see adjacent to Klickitat, we've got other planting areas, including what we call Glenwood, white salmon, little white salmon, and then Trout Lake. So there's this cluster of 5 large planting areas south of Mount Adams. And then just to the east and north, there's something called Highway 97 planting area. And so this effort, when we talk about landscape evaluations, it's part of this ongoing work for the 20-year strategic plan. And we have this really fun team to work with of scientists and planners. So Andrew's there in the room with you all today. And within our Forest Resilience Division, there's several other programs that are really vital, including our aerial survey, entomology, pathology program, our federal lands program, which works through Good Neighbor Authority on federal lands, community and landowner assistance, and I think I heard Sharon was there today, and then our cross-boundary restoration unit, which includes prescribed fire as well as a new post-fire program. And then there's the rest of DNR, including state lands and aquatics and geology. So we saw a similar map to this before, and just to highlight again, Klickitat is down here at the southern portion. And so one of the things we do is we produce these summary reports for what we call landscape evaluations. And so to show you highlights from our Klickitat one, the cover here shows fire risk distributed across the planting area. And then as we set up our framework, there really are two main components overall. We're interested in establishing baseline conditions and a treatment need, as well as prioritizing where treatments could occur to restore these landscapes. And that's part of what we call our dual benefit spatial prioritization, which includes a forest health component, as well as a benefiting fire operations component. And so these are all the different pieces that go into our landscape evaluations. And we certainly won't have time today to get into it, but a future meeting, we could dig in deeper. So on the left, we have this this rainbow pattern here, where some of the key pieces include looking at departure and restoration need, fire risk and transmission, fire operations, climate change, wildlife habitat, aquatics, and economics. And we combine these in our analyses to come up with 3 different components really of our decision support system. And the one I'll focus on today, or I'll highlight anyway, is landscape treatment priority. We also have that dual benefit I mentioned, and then what we're calling cross-boundary collaborative planning. And when it comes to departure, a lot of this is based on what the forest landscape looked like historically and what it looks like today. And so one example from the Cascades is this Mission Ridge area. And you can see historically, almost 100 years ago, much more open conditions. And then in 2010, actually, this area had filled in with conifer forests. And then in 2012, actually, up on Table Mountain, a big chunk of this landscape also burned. So these are dynamic landscapes. And in general, we've got densification of forest lands occurring. In the case of the Klickitat planting area, we use an approach based on state and transition models and current imagery from digital aerial photogrammetry. And I won't have time to go into the details of this today, but certainly in another presentation. And so part of this is we take the current condition and we classify it into different structure classes. And in general, these are what we could call small, medium, and large trees based on the average tree size. And then we break it into whether it's open, moderate, or closed canopy forest based on the canopy cover. And again, this is focused primarily on conifer forests. So here's that fire risk map again, showing certainly some pockets of high and very high fire risk throughout this landscape. And so when we look at departure, this is getting into the summary of those structure classes and the current condition, and then what that would have been historically. And the dominant theme here is that we've got a lot of closed canopy forest, and historically there was much more open forest. And so all the places that are currently pink, a straightforward recommendation or treatment need is to move from a closed canopy to more open canopied condition. And especially the large open condition is the one in this ponderosa pine vegetation type that is missing, right? Currently, there's only 1% of the landscape in a large open condition. Historically, it was between 31 and 44% of this vegetation type. Okay, and then in the interest of, this just shows that in general, there's a lot of different pathways to move. So you can go from large closed to medium open, large closed to small open. Pretty much all the arrows that were pointing towards a more open condition. And then dry mixed conifer forest, which is actually about 60% of this planting area, so the most abundant. It's a somewhat similar story, but really what's missing here is that large open condition. There is a fair bit of small open and medium open size classes. So the treatment need is really to move from that large closed condition towards large open and large moderate. And you could also consider moving some of that medium closed to more open conditions, because historically that range was from 7 to 17%, currently at about 9%. And then also, how can we move towards a larger tree condition in general? So maybe some thinning in the small and medium closed, but then allowing some time for those trees to grow into a larger condition. And then the overall click-attack treatment need, and this is emphasized in our report, shows that across this area, the largest treatment need is that medium to large, dense forest condition. And we've got upwards of 34,000 to 41,000 acres that are in need of treatment in that condition. In this case, we've got a variety of landowners, and industrial private landowners are the most widespread, but there's also a fair bit of non-industrial, as well as DNR trust lands and DFW lands, and some tribal land in the planning area. There's also a significant maintenance treatment need. So this is about 5,000 to 7,000 acres in that more open forest condition. And then across all forested acres, about 40 to 50% of these acres are recommended for treatment. I'm going to pass through that one. And just to show you an example of how we go from treatment need to treatment priority location. So this is actually a map from the Methow Valley, but it shows how we combine these 4 different elements, including fire risk, drought vulnerability, overabundant or departed forest structure, and then fire transmission to homes. And it's important to note that really this is information we provide. It's certainly not a mandate. In our division, we don't control any land management directly, so we're providing recommendations for all landowners. So here's that fire risk map again. You can see some pockets of higher fire risk in these western portions, and more central, as well as the southeastern component where we have some of that little more infrastructure. And here's our drought vulnerability map. And so this is one where it ties in directly to the trailing edge forest topic. So in this case, we've got currently most of the landscape is in a high moisture deficit condition. You can see pockets, including these north-facing slopes along the Klickitat River, where we've got more moderate deficit. And then in the future, a lot of this landscape is going to be in a very high deficit condition. So all this gray area may not be suitable for conifer forest anymore. And you can see how portions that are currently in this orange on the left side, on the west of the Klickitat River, that are gray in the future, this lines up with what our trailing edge analysis showed as a high amount of trailing edge forest. And here's an example of just showing current forest structure. This is that dense, dry forest condition in orange, which is distributed pretty widely across the area. And then current land ownership, which is really quite an interesting mixture. And then the last piece of the puzzle is for the landscape treatment priority is what we call fire transmission. And so this map shows locations that are more likely to affect homes and structures if a fire were to start, for example, in this western portion of the planning area, and then farther south near the Columbia Gorge. So we take those elements and put them all together And this is our landscape treatment priority map. And in this case, what really pops out is this western corner and the southern portion. So that's places with high transmission and fire risk, as well as that high drought vulnerability. And then one other element we highlight is what we call large dense forest sustainability. And so these are some locations where we might be able to maintain and build some of that large tree habitat. And in this case, the places that are more of a blue-green component are places with a higher sustainability score, places with lower fire risk, lower drought vulnerability. Usually it's the inverse of that treatment priority map. So I know this is just a really quick kind of pour through some of the analysis we do in the specific geography. When it comes from establishing treatment targets to getting to actual treatments, a lot of the work that I'm involved in is really the beginning of this journey, this target up here. And then there's a lot of ongoing work where we bring in other pieces, including that dual benefit analysis, economic factors, and then really sitting down in these collaborative settings with partners and landowners to figure out objectives and how different folks can bring tools and to the table and actually implement treatments and continue this journey towards adaptive management. And some of the tools we have include machine-based operations, prescribed fire, as well as wildfire. And I think a topic for another day would be what we call our work of wildfire assessment. So there's a link here, and I'll share the slides, and folks can peruse that to get a sense of how we're making sense of recent fire seasons and how it fits into the goals of the strategic plan. A lot of the information we create and provide for these planning areas is available online. So here's a slide with links to data and landscape evaluation information. And then with that, I see that it's 12 o'clock, and I don't want to take up too much time before you all have your lunch, but I'd be happy to have a little bit of discussion and hear what you're thinking about how that trailing edge concept really fits in with some of the work you all are doing.